What's up, guys? Welcome back to Bald Guy Sci. So this is our third episode in our Ecology series, and this is actually going to be a two-part video. We're talking about some of the resources that cycle around the ecosystem to make everything live, survive, and thrive. So if you want to review any other part of this playlist, you can do that right here. And again, this is going to be Ecology Part 3, Cycles in the Ecosystem. Be a little ironic that I'll be quoting a hairband for this week, but 80s hairband Rat sang this famous chorus. Round and round, what comes around goes around. Well, I'm sure that they weren't talking about the concepts in ecology, and maybe probably more of a you reap what you sow kind of observation in life, but both of those kind of stand on their own. So what kind of person you are in word and action is the kind of words and actions that you'll generally attract from other people. What goes around comes around. That should all kind of give us a moment of pause. Okay. In the ecosystem, things that go around come around as well. These cyclical resources find their way into different organisms in all sorts of ways that help that organism survive and thrive in the ecosystem where it finds itself.
Dad, don't we eat the antelope?
Yes, Simba, but let me explain. When we die, our bodies become the grass, and the antelope eat the grass. And so, we are all connected in the great circle of life.
The main cyclers, if you will, are water, carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitrogen, and energy. Well, these abiotic factors are interconnected with one another and ultimately depend on each other to reveal the niche and the biochemistry of different organisms. But the uniting factor of cycling resources and all of these things can be thought of as energy. So all organisms need energy to live, to grow, and to reproduce, and all organisms adapt a unique way of attaining that energy and therefore expending or either storing it. So the assimilation of energy and the utilization of energy happen both at the cellular levels and the ecosystem level. So we'll discuss them as something called trophic levels. In other words, we categorize organisms based on their preferred method or choice of energy consumption or production. So we start off by breaking them into two categories. Number one, we break them into producers or consumers. So if an organism can manufacture its own energy or produce its own energy from things in the environment, we call them autotrophs, or automatically making their own energy. But heterotrophs mean that they have to get their energy from something outside of or other than themselves. So a heterotroph would be a consumer. So plants, which are photosynthetic, use light to build energy storage molecules. They're the most common things that we think of as autotrophs, but there are other organisms that live deep in the ocean near underwater volcanoes that can make their own food, not from light, but from chemicals. So we wouldn't call them photosynthetic, we'd call them chemosynthetic. And these chemicals are being spewed from underwater volcanoes all the time. These are environments that you and I couldn't live in as earth dwellers, but these guys thrive. So because they're autotrophic, even though they don't use photosynthetic, they don't use light, they are still producers. Well, heterotrophic organisms are organisms that get their energy from something else. So we commonly call them consumers because they don't produce it, they consume energy. So how they consume that energy can be further organized or classified based on the type of food that they consume. So we think of things like herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and decomposers should kind of come to mind. But there's another way to describe them by the term primary, secondary, or tertiary, which means third. And those are words that describe the level as we go up from producers that organism eats. So I eat, therefore I am a consumer. But an herbivore, which eats only plants or herbs, right, is the first or primary consumer. So a producer made energy, not really made it, but they stored energy in a form that was available to us consumers. That primary consumer, an herbivore, is the first one to eat that plant, okay? Now, if that organism, that herbivore, gets eaten by something else, usually a carnivore, right, it would be the secondary consumer. And that energy passes along from primary to secondary to tertiary. But each time it does, only a small amount of energy is actually passed on to the next level up. See, the majority, about 90% of the energy that we consume is used up to stay alive, like to keep us warm or to keep us cool or to move food through our systems or to escape predators or whatever it might be. Energy is consumed. Well, after we consume it, it's burned up or used. It's actually just released back into the environment in a different form. So it can be used again and again by a different organism. So energy is that thing that is universal and connects our other things. So decomposers, they're kind of the opposite of producers. They don't build storage chemicals out of smaller base building blocks they find as abiotic factors in the environment. They take large energy storage chemicals made by producers and consumers, and they break them back down into those individual components to release the energy that's stored in the chemical bonds. So if a plant composes or puts together a molecule to store energy, or a rabbit composes a protein molecule to build muscle, a decomposer breaks that chemical down, whether it's a dead animal or a dead plant or whatever it might be, to break apart those chemical bonds to access the energy that was stored when it was composed. So decomposers are actually in the business of returning those molecules back to the soil. They can return them to the air, they can return them to the water, but they do go back into the ecosystem to be used by other organisms. So this connection between plants and animals occurs in another way as well. Plants need specific raw materials to store that energy molecule, and we break things back down into those specific raw materials. So the raw materials are carbon dioxide and water. These are precisely the byproducts that we as consumers produce when we release that energy for living and thriving, right? And that happens in a process called cellular respiration. So this creates a weird back and forth cycle between plants and animals. And so it's referred to as the carbon dioxide oxygen cycle. So a plant takes in carbon dioxide. It doesn't really breathe, but it pulls in carbon dioxide and pulls water up from its roots. It uses energy from the sun. And that energy from the sun, it builds a molecule. So sunlight, or photo, and to build or put together, synthesize, is photosynthesis. And that builds a molecule called glucose. Now, glucose is a storage chemical made by plants that we like because it's sugar. Now, we take in the waste product of that process, oxygen, and we use it to break down the very chemical that a plant produced. So we eat something like a plant that might have sugar, maybe it's an apple. We breathe in that oxygen, and our bodies actually take that oxygen through our respiratory system, our digestive system, and our cardiovascular system, move those things around to our cells, and our cells break that molecule down to release the energy. So we breathe in O2, our lungs transport that to our cells respire or break down a larger chemical into its energy, and then the whole process reverses and we exhale carbon dioxide. The plant then has that carbon dioxide available to build another molecule. Okay, so it's constant back and forth between producers and consumers is not just about energy, but it's also about oxygen. The whole thing is going to create this CO2-O2 cycle. Okay, well, this is kind of the part where I realize and confess that this is a gross oversimplification of a pretty complex process. So involved in this cycle is not just consumers and producers breathing in, breathing out, making sugar, breaking it down. There's also some other relationships with things that happen in the ecosystem, like fire and things like that. But we can actually discuss that energy production and consumption in simplicity, like a food chain, right? Or a little bit more complex food web. We can also talk about this universal nature in all ecosystems in terms of what's known as a pyramid. So in the energy pyramid, as things move up, they're basically the same, except that in each individual ecosystem, the specific populations that might be the herbivores in a prairie would be different from those that might be in a forest. So the specific populations that fulfill those roles might change, but the actual roles are still the same, and we're going to see that universally across each ecosystem. So besides seeing the players on the stage changing, we can survey the different ecosystems of the world, and we might understand that there are supporting actors that actually must be in place for this stuff to happen as well. So those supporting actors are chemicals like water and nitrogen. So next week, we're going to be investigating how those supporting actors, nitrogen and water, contribute to the movement of energy and nutrients throughout the system and actually make things like CO2 oxygen cycle work. Well, since what goes around comes around, next week I'll tell you why. Yeah. Apparently, when it takes you 2 videos to get through one topic, you have no, in the words of Rat, lack of communication. So tune in next week for Ecology Part 4, the nitrogen and water cycles. And as always, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and go ahead and click that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you'll know whenever next week's video drops. And until next time, this is Bald Guy Sai. See you later.